Hi and welcome to this series where I go through the Itil 4 practices individually to give you the main headline points you need to be aware of to help you support your base knowledge around Itil 4. As well as that, I cover the overall context and some of my real world first-hand experience when I've worked in other organisations. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, click the bell. Okay, let's get to it. Today I'm going to be covering off one of my favourite areas, which is risk management from the general management practice. Quick reminder, a practice is all about a set of organisational resources designed for performing work or accomplishing an objective. So first off, let's just get some general points and some thought processes going around risk management. You may hear the term risk appetite, and the element of that really just to think through is that when I consider some of the different sectors I've worked in, there's definitely some sectors that have more appetite for risk than other sectors. Financial services is a really good example. So just kind of park that really more than anything else. Just think about risk appetite. It's not one size fits all. Some organisations have a larger appetite for risk and others less so. Also think about maturity levels as well. Definitely in some of the organisations I've worked in, there are quite mature practices and not so quite mature practices. There are elements such as qualitative, quantitative methodologies in place. They have risk logs, assessments, matrix. They look at the likelihood, the impact, the consequence, regular reviews of compensating controls, mitigation strategies, all activities that will reduce the type of risk. And it covers lots of different types of risk as well. So commercial, regulatory, customer, perhaps PR risk, material, non-material, contractual, tangible, non-tangible, lots of different types of risk. But the point really to think about is not only do customers and organisations and different service providers have different levels of maturity, it's all about having that balanced approach to risk. So balance of probability, for example. And then the other bit in terms of sort of thinking through risk generally in the widest sense is risk quite often is seen as a negative activity. It's a bad thing, but actually sometimes risk can be beneficial. It can have a positive outcome. It's all one of balance. Much more on that later on. So if we look at Itil 4 and the risk management practice, purpose of risk management is to ensure that the organisation understands and effectively handles risk. So managing risk, that's a key point there, management of risk, and we'll come on to that shortly as to what does that actually mean. But management of risk is essential to ensure the ongoing sustainability of an organisation and of course the co-creation of value for its customers. Risk management is an integral part of all organisational activities and therefore it's central to the service value system. We'll talk about the service value chain later on as well, and of course that's at the centre of the service value system and the various activities that risk management's involved in. So more on that later, but as a tip, it's involved in the activities around plan, improve, engage, design, transition, obtain and build, and deliver and support. If you're already familiar with the service value chain, you're probably going, yep, that's all of them. And absolutely, it's risk management is involved in all elements of the service value chain. So what does Itil 4 say about addressing risk? How do you address risk effectively for your organisation? Well, for starters, you need to govern it. You need to think about a cultural mindset. A mindset change may need to be put in there. It may need to grow. It needs to be nurtured into your ecosystem. You need to get people to start to think more about what could go wrong, but what's the likelihood? What are the possible actions that we could do to help mitigate or reduce that risk perhaps? Then you need to record it, and you need to identify it, what people are saying or what you found out in your analysis. Once you have that, it's important to go through those risks that you've recorded, analyse them further, review them, assess them. Look at things like, what would be the impact if that happened? What's the likelihood? Realistically, I don't know, out of 5, 5 is very likely, 1 is not very likely. What's the likelihood? Likewise for probability, out of 5, is it really probable this is going to happen, or less so? And then exposure as well, what does it actually mean? And then the next step around risk management is actually addressing them, doing something about it, giving them the medicine, treating them. And this activity is around planning, perhaps assign it to somebody, make somebody own it, give it to somebody. Mitigating impacts, if it does happen, perhaps monitoring. I've certainly seen risk registers and risk activities recorded from a RAG perspective, red, amber, green. What's the current status of it? Is somebody reviewing it? Are we reporting on those risks? The point around risks generally is that they come in all shapes and all sizes. They're not fussy. Doing nothing is a risk in itself. So as an option, in some cases, as long as you've assessed it, as long as it's been flagged, as long as it's been recorded and it's been analysed, doing nothing actually is an option. So just be aware that risks come in all shapes and sizes. They're not fussy. They will look at any kind of opportunity, if you like, to disrupt. Risks can also be commercial opportunities. So earlier on I said about risks being negative. They can also be positive. There can be commercial risks that if you take can be quite profitable. So perhaps a commercial opportunity could be a risk, in that if you don't do that, you're losing that commercial opportunity. There's an opportunity to grow. Perhaps it's a technical risk, perhaps it's a legal or a political or a social or an environmental risk. The scope of risk is far and wide. So where do you start typically? If you're doing a 101, where do you start with risk management? For me, the service catalogue has always been a good starting place, at least. Not the answer to absolutely everything, but it's certainly a good starter for 10. You'll have all your products and services in there, so that will certainly help. As you start to look at risk management in more detail, you'll find out that there's ways of addressing risks. And I said a moment ago about one of the options is actually do nothing. That is an option, absolutely. But typically, in terms of ways to address a risk, you can avoid it. So maybe just don't do the thing that is risky. You can reduce it. So you could put something in place to reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact of some kind, or mitigate it in some way. You can share it. You can share a risk with somebody. You might say to yourself, who's going to do that then? Well, if you think about insurance is a good example, or a service provider, or if you get someone else to do that activity for a price, people will do it. Clearly, insurance, you're sharing that risk. That risk is with somebody else. So it's just a way to think about it, is that you can share a risk. You don't have to take it. You can accept a risk as well. So it's okay to do nothing if you've evaluated it, if you've looked at it, if you've analysed it, if it's worth it, you can accept it. If I think of a real world example, now this was a few years ago, where there was a large legacy IT system that had been provided by a service provider to the organisation that I was working for at the time. I was consulting for them. The service provider issued the RCA, the root cause analysis of a major P1, so there was a major outage. And part of the problem management practice, the answer came out to say, okay, so we know what the issue is, we know that it's a legacy system, and in order to address that particular system outage, we need to upgrade a particular module. There's a lot of development, there's a lot of activity. Now the cost of that was estimated at around $2 million. So the point as to which that risk was accepted was put in the context of, well, strategically that particular legacy IT system was on the roadmap for being decommissioned. In fact, it was due to be decommissioned within the following 12-month period. So the business actually accepted the risk in that particular circumstance. So we knew what we needed to do in order to fix it. The service provider had produced a very detailed root cause analysis, and that had been given to the business, and on balance the risk was accepted. The decision was, it's not worth spending $2 million on resolving this particular issue, because the loss of business was certainly less than $2 million, and the system was on the roadmap for being decommissioned. The other point to look at risk is through a different lens and a different approach. There are methodologies that can be used. There's the qualitative risk analysis, which tends to be a bit more subjective, or the quantitative analysis, the risk analysis, and that's more objective. So if we look at the subjective way of risk analysis, that tends to focus on identifying risks to measure both the likelihood and the specific risk event occurring during a project life cycle and the impact that it would have on the overall schedule should it hit. Goal is about determining severity. The objective risk analysis approach uses verifiable data to analyze the information and the effect of the risk. And perhaps that might be a cost overrun, perhaps that could be a scope creep of some kind, or consumption of resource, or delay, scheduled delay. The point about the objective analysis is that it assigns a numerical value to the risk. Risk has a 60% chance of occurring based on the data that we've analysed, and that could be resources, that could be activity, could be logistics, or the 15% chance of causing a delay of 100 days. It's entirely dependent on the quantity and the accuracy of the data. So you've got two methodologies there, the subjective way and the objective way. Principles around risk management that you would be wise to observe is that making sure risk is part of the organisation. So risks are needy, they need managing. So what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean that they all need to be avoided and resolved and fixed or mitigated. It's about understanding them, it's about balancing them, it's about looking at your company's risk appetite. The other principle you'd be wise to observe is one of consistency. So take a holistic view of risk. Remember that actually goes back to one of the Itil 4 guiding principles on this principle, in fact. So make sure you've got consistency. As a general kind of real world example, it's not unusual for different operating units, different countries, different regions, different departments in some cases to have different levels of risk appetite. So there is a challenge there, but certainly taking that holistic view on risk is an important element, but you need to balance that against different departments, different operating units, perhaps different countries or regions. And then mature and instill a culture, mature and instill a behaviour. Seek to embed risk as a consideration into, that's just the way we do things here. If there's a new service, if there's a new activity, risk is embedded in that way of thinking. That's just the way things are done. It just is. So it's very wise to try and instill that culture and that behaviour. Think about measurement as well, so reporting on risk. How will you report on risk and to who? as I think about some real world examples in terms of risk registers and risk reporting activities I've been involved in, metrics around how many risks have been closed, how many have we identified this quarter, perhaps some kind of frequency reporting, so how many risks have occurred more than once, how many times has that risk occurred twice, how many times has that risk occurred 3 times. Come on, it's kind of those kind of activities that start to say, well, we need to do something about that. Maybe percentage of risks on the risk register that are classed as high is a good metric, or the percentage of risks that have been reviewed in the last quarter, or the percentage of risks that are high that have been reviewed in the last quarter, percentage of reduction or corrective activities, particularly on high risk items would be of interest, or the number of audit flags or audit fails as a result of risk and potential, or maybe, and I've seen this in a few organisations, how much does risk management cost? What is the cost of that? So there's some ideas just for you to think through a little more in terms of measurement and reporting on risk. If we think through risk management practice in terms of other practices within Itil 4, there's certainly plenty of them, and I'll go through a number of items that you should think about and be aware of in terms of which practices dovetail into risk. I'll start with change. So when I talk about change, I mean both from an organisational change perspective, from the general management practice, i.e. the people, but also technical change as well. So change control from the service management practice. CI, continuing improvement, from the general management practice. Financial management from the general management practice. Information security management from the general management practice. So perhaps think about the CIA, so confidentiality, integrity, availability, non-repudiation, access control. Good areas to think about from a risk perspective and where that dovetails into information security management. Problem management from the service management practice. Cause of incidents is clearly a risk, especially a P1 or something that's service impacting, or perhaps a security incident or a regulatory incident or a continuity incident, just as examples to get you thinking around how does risk management impact some of these other practices. Project management, clearly we've all worked on projects where there's a risk register, or I hope you have. So the problem management practice within general management. Strategy management from the general management practice. Service continuity management from the service management practice. Service level management is a really good one as well. So think about service risks, any contractual concerns in there, any costs to be aware of, or any risks there around cost. Service credits with service providers is a really good example of that. What about, is there a risk there that potentially the service being provided isn't good enough, and perhaps there's likely to be a service credit conversation. The service value chain. So as with a lot of practices, the service value chain comes into play, and risks contribute to all of the activities in the service value chain. So as a refresher, you have plan, improve, engage, design and transition, obtain and build, and delivery and support. The risk management practice contributes to all of those activities. Plan, just as an example, if we unpick that a tiny bit. So for example, plan may involve a change in your customer or a change in your stakeholders' demand requirement, or maybe it's their priority. Perhaps there's a new regulatory change or adoption of a regulatory change that is currently in place at your organisation, but perhaps it's not as robust as originally thought. Maybe it needs tightening up a little. Wonder if you've ever been involved in that situation. New competitors on the horizon, perhaps. What's a risk we need to think about? Okay, there's a new player that's arrived on the scene. What are the risks there? Disruptive IT technology should be considered. Again, I've worked in the insurance and banking industry over the years, and there's been plenty of disruptive IT technology and changes there that have revolutionized the way we do banking, the way insurance products are offered. Think about the disruptive technologies there. What's the risk to your organisation? It's a good conversation to have. Final thoughts to ponder about risk management. We can think of risk as a possible event. It may happen, it may not happen. It may cause harm to your organisation or loss of some kind, or maybe it's not as dramatic as that and it just makes it harder to achieve what you're trying to achieve in the first place. It's that uncertainty of an outcome. There is an ISO perspective on risk, and it's ISO 31000-2018. It's a 16-page document, and it is actually quite interesting to go through it. I won't go through it in detail on this session, but it is worth looking up the guidelines. It talks about creation, it talks about protection of value, and it's a guideline. It's the guideline on managing risk and the application of that. So how do you do it? The general idea with that document is you customize it to your organisation. And finally, as a parting point, risk, it can reap benefits. Don't always see it as a negative. It can actually be a positive. So taking a risk can sometimes yield beneficial results. It's all about perception. It's about the appetite level of your organisation. It's an overall balanced view. It's what you need to consider those against the risk overall. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe, hit the bell to get the updates. Thank you very much.